most common tenses, active and passive, that you are going to use when it comes to this essay. So first, let's go ahead and look at the present simple passive. So this is going to be used when the action is more important than the person who completes it. So for that, we have this formula: the object plus the verb to be plus the past participle. So let's look at a couple of examples. We see waste is separated into its different types. 2 separate cells are taken from 2 female sheep. So in this case, we do not know who separates the waste. We do not know how or who takes these 2 separate cells. It isn't important because the action is the most important thing. And that is what you're going to be focusing on in this essay. You're going to be looking at steps and a process. So it isn't important who completes these, but what actually happens. This is different than the present simple active. In this case, you have the object plus the verb. So here we see, in a traditional hydroelectric power plant, river water rises behind a dam until it is sufficiently high enough to enter an intake pipe near the top. In this case, we know that river water is active, it is rising. The second example, at the start, lake water passes through intake screens to remove any large pieces of waste that may block the pipe. In this case, we see lake water is active because it passes through. Lastly, we see initially the female moth deposits her eggs on a mulberry leaf. The female moth is being active. The female moth deposits the eggs, so there isn't anyone else involved. It isn't passive because we know who or what is doing it, and this may sometimes come up as well. Perhaps the most complex is the present perfect passive. This is object, to be, and the past participle. However, the to be must be in the present perfect. So I'll show you an example. It says, once the milk has been transferred to a tanker, it is subsequently delivered to the dairy. Now, since we have milk is third person, so it is has been transferred. This would be the to be in the present perfect form. So again, we do not know who transfers the milk. We also don't know when the milk has been transferred. In this case, we are not specific, and this is why it's great for talking about a process, because usually in the process, it's a general process. We're not going to know specific times. However, if you do know when, if there are different stages with different times and different days, for example, make sure you're using the past simple passive. The second example says, when the milk has been delivered to the dairy, it is then put through a pasteurization process. Now, in this case, we have a present perfect right in the beginning, so when the milk has been delivered. Since we are specific, it's a specific moment in time, it is then put through a pasteurization process. So you see we have a mix here with present perfect and past simple. Then our last example, as soon as the milk and dairy products have been processed and packaged, they are then sent out to supermarkets where they are stacked onto shelves and ready for purchase. Same idea here. The only thing here, you see that milk and dairy products, these are plural, so our verb to be changes to have been. So milk and dairy products have been processed and packaged. Again, then we are specific with the time in the process, so we have the past simple. So remember, in general, you're going to use the present perfect passive. There may be times where you use the past simple when you are talking about things that are after or in a specific moment in the process, but these are the 3 main types of passive and active formulas that you can expect to use for this specific question type. So definitely keep these in mind. Practice them when you can, because this will just make your writing that much stronger. Something else I'd like to go through just before we start looking at our example today is sequencing. This is extremely important for this question type because, again, you'll have to describe the process and the stages of a process. So I split this up for you into initial stages, middle stages, and final stages. These are some great phrases that you can use for each stage. So for example, we have at the start, first of all, to begin with, in the first stage, in the middle stages, then after that, following this, after which, the next step is, and also subsequently. The final stages, we have finally, the final step is, or the final stage is. So really commit these to memory. Think of how you can use them in your essays, and this will really help your language score. Let's look at an example. So we see here, in the first stage, cows graze in the fields, and after that, the cows are put into a milking machine twice a day. Following this, the milk is put into refrigeration storage, after which it is transferred to a tanker. Subsequently, it is pasteurized, processed, and made into cheese. The final step is to send out the milk and dairy products to the supermarkets. And you see here how we have used these sequencers, really helpful phrases, in one sentence if you can, or in various sentences in your paragraph. So this and your passive and your active and your present perfect and your past simple will really be important when writing your essay. So without further ado, let's get started and look at how we are going to format and write our essay today. Now here's a very helpful guide that you can follow today just so that everything is clear. There are two quite simple steps. The first step is going to be analyzing the diagram and describing the key information. And our second step is going to be writing an essay using our recommended essay structure. So we're just going to analyze the diagram, look at the different stages, describe key information, and then make it into a lovely essay. Now the structure is going to look like this. We are going to have 3 paragraphs. So it's going to be an introduction, the first thing, and in the introduction, we are going to paraphrase the question and state the main key details. Now by paraphrasing, what we're going to do is basically restate the question in different words. So this is really going to call upon our synonyms, and this will just make sure that we're writing and answering the questions that are necessary. Then our last 2 paragraphs are going to be body paragraph 1. In this case, we're going to describe the first half of the process, and then body paragraph 2, where we're going to describe the second half of the process, and that is it. This will make sure that we are including all of the relevant details without adding anything else that is unnecessary, and it's going to be very concise, it's going to be logical, 3 simple paragraphs. So with all of this in mind, let's take a look at our first writing prompt for today. We'll analyze the details and then we'll put this to the test. Okay, here's our first essay for today. Now I'm going to read the prompt and then we'll take a look at this diagram and then make our notes as necessary. First it says, the diagram below shows the process of yogurt making. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features, and make comparisons where relevant. Write at least 150 words. Okay, so this is our prompt for today. We see that we have a numbered process 1 through 8. Now this doesn't always mean that the first 4 steps will automatically go in your first paragraph and the last 4 will go in your second paragraph. We should really look at this and analyze what it's telling us. So I'm just going to go ahead and underline some words here and just make sure that we're on the same page when it comes to understanding this diagram. Number 1 says heat milk to 100 degrees Celsius, cool milk until slightly warm, thin some old yogurt with a little cold milk, whisk yogurt and milk together until smooth and the yogurt is dissolved, pour the yogurt mixture into the warmed milk, wrap mixture in towels to keep it warm, wait for the yogurt to set for 4 hours, and then refrigerate the yogurt. Now, what comes to my mind immediately is the preparation work and then the setting work. So I would actually break up these two stages into all the preparation and then waiting for the yogurt to set. Let's go ahead and take a look at our step 1. And so we're going to analyze the diagram and describe the key information, looking at the first half and the second half of the process. Now, again, this is going to be subjective. What you think is the first half and the second half is really up to you. It's not going to make or break your essay. Just make sure that everything is done in a logical way and in an organized way. So I'm going to say that the first half of the process is basically everything from heating the milk up until pouring the yogurt with warm milk. So I'm going to talk about steps 1 through 5. And then I'm going to use these last 3 steps, 6, 7, and 8, for my second half. So I'm going to talk about the final stage here, and that's going to be wrapping the mixture all the way up to refrigerating the yogurt. And so this step is really just to make sure that I understand the process and that I have a brief outline. Just this box is good enough to make sure I know where I'm going and where I'm stopping and what I'm going to add. This is technically optional, but I would highly recommend using some sort of small, brief outline. Remember, no one is going to see this outline, so you can make abbreviations and you don't have to use perfect grammar. This is just for you. You could also make notes directly on your prompt like I've done. If you'd like, you could also write your sequencers if you have memorized them and you want to make sure that you don't forget any of your sequencers. That's also a great idea. Now, before we actually start writing the essay, I just want to take you back to reflect on the scoring and what the examiner is going to be looking at when reading your essay. This will give us a great backdrop for words to include and the logic and the organization behind our essay. So let's take a look at that now. Okay, let's take a look at the scoring. We'll talk about each of the points. First off, we have the task achievement. This is going to deal with whether or not we've answered the question. So have we described the stages of the process of making yogurt? Have we done so in a minimum of 150 words? I will say that this specific question type actually makes it difficult to meet that minimum requirement just because it might seem so clear-cut and simple, and you don't really have to talk about an overview because there isn't really anything to observe when it comes to trends. So the fact that we have 3 paragraphs, really have to make sure that we're adding everything in and meeting our 150-word requirement. So this is very important here. Did we answer the question at hand? Second, we have coherence and cohesion. So does it make sense? Is it logical? Did we start in a logical way? So this means you don't want to start with the final stage. You want to start with the first stage of the process and then use our sequencers to go on from there. The 3-paragraph rule with this specific question type will make this very clear. Now, the last 2 areas are lexical resource and grammatical range and accuracy. This is where your word choice comes in, your spelling, your sequencers, your present perfect passive versus active voice or past passive. All of that stuff that we talked about at the beginning of this video will come in handy when you want to get maximum points for these 2 areas. So really recognize that 2 of these areas have to do with your work on the essay, and 2 of them really have to do with your preparation work and all of your knowledge of grammar and vocabulary coming into the exam. So just keep that in mind. Very important to prepare and very important to remember this when writing the essay. Okay, so with that being said, let's go ahead over and write our essay now with our outline in mind. Now we have all of our preparation work on the left-hand side and our actual diagram. So I'm going to write on the right-hand side here. And I've included these 3 headings just for us today. Do not write this on the exam, but this is just to give you a good idea of how I'm going to separate my essay. So if you remember correctly, the first introduction paragraph is going to paraphrase the question, the task here that we see. So I'm going to start and I'm going to say the flow chart illustrates the yogurt making procedure. Overall, the process involves 8 steps, which can be grouped into 3 main stages: preparing the milk, mixing the ingredients, and setting the yogurt. And let's just talk about this here. So instead of saying diagram, I've said flow chart. And instead of saying shows, I've said illustrates. And the process of yogurt making, I've basically just flipped it into saying the yogurt making procedure. Now, I talked about the 8 steps, and I grouped it into 3 main stages, sort of like what we talked about when we analyzed the diagram. I have talked about how the 3 main stages are preparing the milk, then mixing the ingredients, and then setting the yogurt. In my body paragraphs, I'm going to basically include the first 2 steps, and then in my body paragraph 1, I'm going to include the first 2 stages, and then the body paragraph 2 is going to be wrapping and setting the yogurt. This is what I mean by really making sure that you're analyzing the diagram and not just splitting 4 and 4 for these 8 steps into body paragraph 1 and body paragraph 2. Always make sure there's some logic behind it. Okay, now let's go into body paragraph 1. In terms of preparing the milk, it is first heated to 100 degrees Celsius on the stove. Following this, it is taken off the heat in order to be cooled to a moderately warm temperature. As far as the second stage of mixing the ingredients is concerned, a little cold milk is added to some old yogurt so as to thin it, after which the yogurt and cold milk are whisked together until the mixture is a smooth consistency with no lumps. Subsequently, the mixture is poured into the warm milk. Now, I've added information here. And like I said earlier, this will really help with this specific question type because it is sometimes difficult to reach this 150-word minimum with this specific prompt and question type. So let's just take a look at what I added. I added on the stove. And obviously it's going to be heated somewhere, but the fact that I saw this flame here is a good indication that it's going to be on the stove, not somewhere like in the oven. Now, this isn't absolutely imperative, but again, it helps with the word count, and it also tells the examiner that you are familiar with language, with different vocabulary words, and it definitely doesn't hurt. It adds something quite important to your essay. Then I said that it is taken off the heat in order to be cooled. So I've also added this as well. It's not just going to be heated and then cooled automatically. So I said it is taken off the heat. And then as far as the second stage of mixing the ingredients is concerned, a little cold milk is added to some of the old yogurt, okay? And then it's whisked together until the mixture is a smooth consistency. I've added this word consistency, and if it is smooth, it will not have any lumps. So I've included no lumps as well, even though that isn't in our diagram. Then I've said subsequently the mixture is poured into the warmed milk. So I didn't add too much, but I just added some nice key phrases about the stove, no lumps, and I just made everything flow a little better. Now we're going to look at body paragraph 2, which remember is the final stage. So we're going to talk about wrapping and then all the way up to refrigerating the yogurt. Final stage is setting the yogurt. Now, after the yogurt has been wrapped in towels to maintain the slightly heated temperature, it is left to set for 4 hours. Lastly, the yogurt is stored in the refrigerator to keep it cool. And there you have it. So let's look at this body paragraph 2. The final stage, like we said, is setting the yogurt. So I'm looking at step 6. after the yogurt has been wrapped in towels to maintain the slightly heated temperature, it is left to set for 4 hours. So notice how I have included 6 first and then 7, but I have used this nice word after. So I've sort of included both steps in one sentence. And then we see lastly, the yogurt is stored in the refrigerator to keep it cool. And of course, I've just added that again to keep it cool, even though we don't see it necessarily in our diagram. Now, this is our essay. I'm just going to clean it up a little bit so we can examine the language and look at the grammar. Okay, and here is our final product. I've eliminated the headings and I've also color-coded it, which we're going to look at together. Now, first off, the word count is 164 words. That's great for this question type. We have definitely fulfilled the minimum, and we have talked about everything that needed to be said when it comes to this process. Let's first take a look at the blue words. These are synonyms and topic vocabulary. Basically, we see milk, ingredients, yogurt. Lumps is something that I added, which is good to know when it comes to whisking and baking. Then I have mixture, poured. This is a great verb, which we saw here, but make sure you're familiar with how to use it, and warm milk. So there isn't that much when it comes to synonyms and topic vocabulary to this specific topic of yogurt making, but it is just good to point out. Also keep in mind the paraphrasing that we did in the introduction paragraph. Let's take a look at the red, important functional words. This sets the stage and makes everything a bit logical. So when we're talking about the whole process, we see overall. Then in terms of something, so we talked about in terms of preparing the milk. This is quite specific because we're talking only about preparing the milk. Then this is a great formula. As far as, and then we have something, is concerned. So we would put a noun here. So as far as the second stage is concerned, and then we talk about it with some detail. These are just great to be specific, give examples, and make the essay just move along. Now let's take a look at our useful vocabulary and phrases. This is in green. So this is very similar to what we saw in our sequencing slide. First, following, after which, subsequently, the final stage, after, and lastly. These are very similar to your important functional words, but they're very specific to stages and sequencing. So make sure that you are committing these to memory and using them when necessary, where appropriate in your essay. And lastly, I just want to show you the bolded phrases here. These are all of the passives. So it is heated, it is taken off, little cold milk is added, the yogurt and cold milk are whisked together, the mixture is poured. Remember, we don't know who is doing this. It is not important, but notice how much passive is in this essay. Lastly here, we do have a present perfect, which is nice. It's a little bit complex that I added these 2 steps in one sentence. You might be thinking that this paragraph is a little bit shorter, and it is. It isn't too short, but it's just short because I was able to effectively combine steps 6 and 7. So don't worry too much about that. Again, the more complex you can make it, the better it'll be for your grammar score. And so remember, we see after something has happened, then it is left to set. So this is why we have the present perfect and the present passive. Think of it as a timeline, just like we see here. So after something has been done, something else happens. And then lastly, the yogurt is stored in the refrigerator. All right, let's take a look at a second example now. And this is going to describe 2 processes. So we're going to switch gears, go a little bit quicker, and see what the second writing prompt can teach us. All right, and here is our second writing prompt for today. You'll notice that this looks a lot different and probably a bit more complicated. So let's go ahead and read our prompt together. It says, the diagram below shows the process by which electricity is generated in 2 types of hydroelectric power stations. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features. write at least 150 words. Now here you see the topic is a bit more complicated and the idea is different. So here we have two processes instead of just one overarching process with stages. So I'll just take you over here on the right-hand side. What we're going to do is describe the first process in our body paragraph 1 and our second process in body paragraph 2. That's really the only thing that will change in this case, but we just have to be a bit more analytical when we look at these two processes. So basically what I'm going to do first, I'm going to look at this traditional hydroelectric plant, this smaller one. I'm going to look at this first just because it's smaller and it makes more sense for me to approach this first. And I want to understand how it's different from this hydroelectric power. So let's just go ahead and read. We see number 1 is intake, 2 is turbine, 3 is power. So the step is 1, 2, and 3. Here in hydroelectric power, we see 1, for a run of river plant, water flowing downhill is diverted from the river into a new channel. Then we see 2, water flow turns turbine blades. Number 3, turbines turn the generators. Number 4, transmission lines conduct electricity. And then number 5, water flows back into the river. So you'll notice that with the traditional hydroelectric plant, we do not have steps 4 and 5. So in general, there's a lot more detail given for the hydroelectric power. And the main thing we want to look at is these 3 stages in a traditional plant versus 5 stages of a hydroelectric power plant. So let's just make a couple of notes for us just to make sure we're on the same page. If we look at process 1, which is the traditional hydroelectric plant, I'm going to say it's 3 stages. I'm going to talk about how the water rises and then it's high enough to go in an intake pipe, because that is exactly what we see here. So I'm looking right from the left, seeing that it goes into an intake pipe. Then it enters, the water flows into a turbine chamber, the blades rotate, and then electricity is generated. Then I see that the power is sent to customers with what looks to be transmission lines. So I'm just going to make that note. And that is all we really have to say for the process 1. Now, process 2, I'm going to say has 5 stages, and I'm going to talk about how water, which looks to be going downhill, goes into turbine blades. Then I'm going to talk about how water is channeled away from the path down into a pipe. So I'm going to say water goes to a pipe down the hill. Then it looks like it enters here, this building. So I'm going to say once it's in the building, the water causes the turbine blades again to rotate. This produces electricity. And then the power, it looks like, is conducted by transmission lines again to where it's needed or to customers. So I'm going to say again, power sent via transmission lines. I'll say it in a different way just to use our synonyms. But the thing I really want to include in the second body paragraph is step number 5. So I see that surplus water exits the plant and goes again back to the river to perhaps resume its original course back to number 1. So you see how my notes for process 2 are a bit longer. That's fine because there are more stages here. Now this step is technically optional, but I would definitely suggest that you do it just because it'll make things clear to you. Of course, these notes do not have to make sense to anyone but yourself. No one is going to be reading them but you. And it's just helpful for you to have this when you are writing your essay. It gives me a clear path. It makes me aware of what these two processes have in common, how they're different. And now I just feel much more prepared to write the essay. So that is all we have to do for our preparation work. Now I'm going to show you the finished essay, color-coded, and we can go through it together. Now, first off, I just want to show you that our word count is 202 words. That makes sense. When it comes to two processes, it's actually easier to get your word count up to where it needs to be. We had a lot to include in this case, so the 202 words definitely fulfills the 150 word minimum, so that's great. And keep a note about these color-coded words. The blue shows synonyms and topic vocabulary, the green, useful vocabulary and phrases, and the red, important functional words. So let's read it together, and I will stop for important things. We'll start here. The diagram compares the process by which electricity is generated in two types of hydroelectric power stations. Overall, electricity produced by a traditional hydroelectric plant is produced in 3 stages, as opposed to in 5 stages at a run-of-river hydroelectric plant. Now, I've emboldened the passive phrases, which again, we really have to pay attention to our passives here. So electricity is generated, electricity produced by shows a very clear passive. In this case, we have shown who is doing the activity or what is doing the activity. Then the red, we have important functional words. Overall is great when talking about general themes, and as opposed to is a great linking phrase to show two contrasting ideas. Then run-of-river hydroelectric plant is topic vocabulary, which we saw right here in number 1. Now, just keep in mind that I still used the diagram. However, I said it compares the process, and in the prompt, it said shows the process. And of course, by which electricity is generated is still what we see in the prompt. It isn't as easy to think of synonyms for this, but still note that we changed it up a bit. Now, if we look at our body paragraph 1, remember we're looking at the traditional plant. So it says, in a traditional hydroelectric power plant, river water rises behind a dam until it is sufficiently high enough to enter an intake pipe near the top. And here we see it. Once it enters, the water flows down into a much lower turbine chamber, whereupon it causes the machine's blades to rotate, thus generating electricity. This power is then sent via transmission lines to customers' homes. Now again, our words in blue are very specific to this type of prompt, and I knew it was river water just because of this phrase here in the other process diagram, so really use this to your advantage. I've emboldened this because it is the active, so it's the difference between active and passive like we looked at earlier in this video. So the river water rises behind a dam. Again, this is just from outside knowledge and vocabulary. For our useful vocabulary and phrases, I have some sequencing here. So I have once and then. So this shows the order, what happens, and then what happens as a process. And whereupon is another great functional word. It basically is a way to say where something happens. Again, I see water flows down, that is active, and then this power is then sent. Again, we don't know what exactly is sending it, so it is the passive. Let's take a look at our body paragraph 2. On the other hand, in a run-of-river hydroelectric plant, the natural flow of the water running downhill is harnessed to turn the turbine blades. Initially, water is channeled away from the water's primary path down a pipe into a turbine building further down the hill that we see right here. Upon entering the building, the water causes turbine blades to rotate, which in turn spins a generator that produces electricity. This power is then conducted by transmission lines above the plant to where it is needed. Surplus water then exits the plant and rejoins the river to resume its original course. Now here, on the other hand, it is a great functional word to show a contrasting idea, or like we have the second process, initially, upon, then, and then again. These are important sequencing and phrases. And then we've got our synonym and topic vocabulary. Harnessed, again, is a great verb to use for this type of diagram and process. Channeled away is excellent for water, or when you see that things are sent in a certain way down or into the river. Then conducted is a great verb for power, and we also see it here. And then the surplus water, the extra water, flows back into the river. And I assume, as what we see here in the diagram, that it is resuming its original course. So it's always okay to add additional thoughts, ideas, vocabulary words to your processes in order to meet your word count and also elaborate a bit on the idea at hand. And again, here in this last paragraph, I just have some active and passive phrases. So water is channeled away, passive. The water causes the turbine blades to rotate. This is active. Power is then conducted by, that's definitely passive. And you'll see here that there are some times where by is used and it's still considered passive, but you just see the actor or the subject along with the object. And then of course this last one here, surplus water then exits, that is active as well. So notice the nice mix of active and passive. We used mostly present tense in this case because it's something that is always true. It's a process that always works. So keep that in mind as well. All right, excellent job today. Let's go ahead and wrap up this lesson looking at diagrams and processes. Let's wrap up with some do's and don'ts. First off, for your do's, you definitely want to analyze your process diagrams, whether you have a simple process like we did in the first example with writing about yogurt, or if you have something more complex with two different processes. So make sure you're analyzing them and understanding your relevant points. You'll need to expand on a couple of things just to make it flow and to meet your word count. So really plan on how to describe the information in terms of your body paragraph 1 and your body paragraph 2. Remember, it might not be as obvious, so that's why analyzing the diagrams before you write is very important. Then when you are going through your essay, make sure you're implementing proper grammar. We looked at this in the beginning of this video when looking at the active and the passive, present perfect versus past simple and present. So really make sure that you are understanding that. And again, just organize your essay using that foolproof method. We've got the introduction, body paragraph 1, and body paragraph 2. Now, for things you don't want to do, you don't want to start writing the essay immediately as you are analyzing your process diagrams and looking at the various stages. You want to set aside some time to analyze first. And we did do this quite slowly today, just so that it was all clear. On your own time, you should be able to do this quite quickly and just take a couple of minutes, 1 or 2 minutes really, to analyze and then start writing. The more you do it, the easier it will be. Don't write the wrong amount. Remember that the risk with this specific question type for a simple diagram is not meeting your word count. So make sure that you are at 150 for sure, and then going a little bit over up until 200, because you also don't want to waste too much time on this writing prompt. And of course, you don't want to use incorrect grammar. This is actually one of the most difficult parts of this specific writing prompt, messing up the active and the passive and the present perfect. So just make sure that you are practicing this and that you are using the grammar you should be using that is relevant to your question. All right, once again, great job. It was a big lesson with grammar. And 2